Halloween night was always a bit too much for me, not because of the holiday itself, but due to the constant doorbell ringing. Children flooded the porch, demanding candy. My 5-year-old Abby loved it, of course. She'd been buzzing around in her little princess costume since the afternoon, her plastic pumpkin pail swinging on her arm. But I was 8 months pregnant, exhausted and struggling to keep up. My feet ached from standing at the door, handing out candy to kids who never seemed to stop coming. By 10 p.m., I'd finally put Abby to bed, her pail of candy tucked under her arm like a teddy bear. I hoped the stream of trick-or-treaters would stop, but they didn't. Not until nearly midnight. Finally, the streets outside grew silent, with only a few faint laughs and the occasional car passing by. I sat down in the living room, candy bowl on my lap, absently munching on the leftovers. Pregnancy cravings had a way of justifying late-night candy binges. I turned on a horror movie, something cheesy and predictable, hoping to unwind after the long night. About 15 minutes into the movie, just as I was beginning to relax, there was a knock at the door. I froze, staring at the screen as though the knock had come from within the movie. Who would be trick-or-treating at this hour? My heart gave a small, reluctant thud as I stood up and shuffled to the door. Through the peephole, I saw a man wearing a werewolf mask, standing silently on the porch. Seriously, I muttered to myself, opening the door just a crack to glare at him. "Trick or treat," he said in a low, almost mocking voice. I squinted at him, my patience already worn thin. "Go home, or I'll call the police," I snapped. He didn't move or say anything else, he just stood there, staring through the cheap plastic mask. I felt a flicker of unease in my gut. There was something wrong about the way he simply stood there, watching me. "Go away," I said louder, slamming the door shut. I waited, listening for his footsteps, but there was only silence. After a few more seconds, I double-locked the door, turned off the porch light, and tried to forget about it. But sleep didn't come easy that night. I tossed and turned, Abby's soft snores from the next room the only sound in the house. My mind kept flashing back to the masked man. Who was he, and why was he there? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around 2 a.m., I woke with a jolt, my heart pounding as though I'd been running. There was no noise, no reason for the sudden dread gripping my chest like a vise. Quietly, I slid out of bed and moved toward Abby's room, maybe driven by a mother's instinct to check on her. The house felt colder than before. As I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. There he was, the man in the werewolf mask, crouched on all fours at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at me with his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His shallow, raspy breathing filled the silence of the house. I couldn't move, my pulse thudded in my ears. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, he let out a low, animalistic growl, like a dog about to pounce. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I turned and sprinted. I could feel him chasing me, his footsteps heavy and fast, but not like a man running. It was more like something crawling. I glanced back, and my blood turned to ice. He was coming after me on all fours, his hands and feet scrambling against the stairs, his body twisting unnaturally as he chased me. He was growling, snarling, howling like a wolf. I reached Abby's room just in time, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook so badly I could barely dial 911. "Please, help me," I whispered into the phone. My voice barely audible over the scratching at the door. "There's someone in my house, ... He's trying to get in." The operator's calm voice tried to reassure me, but it was drowned out by the banging, scratching, and low guttural growls from the other side of the door. The door shuddered as he kicked it, each blow harder than the last. I was shaking like a leaf, pressing my back against the door and holding Abby tightly in my arms, praying for the police to arrive. Then, just as the door was about to give way, I heard the distant wail of sirens. The banging stopped. The scratching went silent. When the police arrived, they found the front door broken, the lock mangled as if by a metal rod. But the man was gone, disappeared into the night as though he'd never been there. They searched the house, checked the neighborhood, but found no trace of him, no clue as to who he was or what he wanted. I'll never forget the way he looked at me through that mask, the silent, patient stare, as if he was waiting for me to open the door again. Halloween night in Greenwood always brought out the best in our neighborhood kids running around in costumes, houses decked out in spooky decorations. It was my favorite time of year. This year, though, Jack Marlowe and his wife, Lisa, truly outdid everyone with their haunted house. They were hosting a small get-together, so I arrived an hour early to help and enjoy the night. My name is Rick Thompson. Jack and I had been good friends and business partners for years, and I knew Lisa well, too. Things had started to get tense between Jack and Lisa lately. I knew about her affair with a younger woman named Diane. It wasn't my place to say anything, so I tried to keep things lighthearted, hoping the tension wouldn't spoil the evening. As the night wore on, we drank and laughed, doing our best to ignore the undercurrent of unease. Around 10 p.m., the doorbell rang, and we all paused. Trick or treat, came a muffled voice from the porch. Jack, always an obliging host, stood up with a bowl of candy. "I'll get it," he said, heading for the door. But something didn't feel right. I followed him into the foyer, but stayed back, hiding in the shadows of the hallway. A horrible feeling crept over me, like something bad was about to happen. Jack opened the door, expecting to see trick-or-treaters. Instead, a figure in a grotesque mask stood there, holding a brown paper bag. Before Jack could react, the figure pulled out a gun and shot him in the face. Jack collapsed instantly, candy spilling everywhere. I froze in terror, holding my breath as I stared from the dark hallway. Lisa screamed, but her reaction seemed strange, almost as though she had been expecting this. The masked intruder took another step into the house, looking for any witnesses. My heart pounded as I shrank further into the shadows. Finally, Lisa broke her trance and screamed, "Help. Someone call the police." Diane, who had been in the living room, rushed out, panic etched across her face. She dashed straight into the masked figure, who immediately raised the gun again. "No witnesses," he hissed. My survival instincts kicked in. I turned to run, but accidentally bumped into a table, sending a glass crashing to the floor. The shattering sound gave me away. The intruder's head jerked in my direction, and I knew it was my turn. I sprinted toward the back door as he chased me, his footsteps heavy and fast. I leapt into the backyard, clearing a low fence into the neighbor's yard. They peered out at me, looking irritated. But I didn't stop. I weaved through the maze of yards, finally reaching the street, where I spotted a police car parked at the end of the block. I flagged them down, breathless and frantic. "Help. My friend's been shot." "The killer's after me," I gasped, pointing back towards Jack's house. The officers sped toward the house, with me following close behind. When we arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Inside, we found Lisa cradling Jack's body, sobbing uncontrollably. Diane was gone, and there was no sign of the masked intruder. The police took my statement. I recounted the horrifying chase and described the masked man. I mentioned Lisa's odd reaction and Diane's sudden disappearance. The officers assured me they would investigate all leads. Days passed, and soon the investigation began to uncover dark secrets in the Marlowe household. Lisa and Diane had been involved in an affair, and resentment towards Jack had festered. The attack was indeed premeditated. Under pressure, Diane was eventually found and confessed, implicating Lisa. She revealed that the masked killer was a hitman hired to get rid of Jack. The murder shocked Greenwood, and the trial that followed gripped the town. Lisa and the hired killer received life sentences, while Diane, who cooperated with the police, received a lesser sentence. Yet, even with justice served, I couldn't shake the memories of that night. Every Halloween, as kids roam the streets in their costumes, I remember Jack and the darkness that hides behind familiar faces. It's a reminder of the thin line between love and betrayal, and of that fateful night when an innocent gathering turned into a horrific nightmare. Every Halloween, our street transformed into a blur of costumes, laughter, and flashing porch lights. Kids raced from door to door, their candy bags growing heavier by the minute. I loved the excitement, the sugar rush, and the sense that we were all part of something magical, if only for one night. But there was one house at the end of the block that no one ever went near, the old McFadden house. Even during the day, it gave off a creepy vibe. Its paint had long since peeled away, leaving rotting wood exposed. The front yard was overgrown, and no one had seen the McFaddens in years. Some people said they'd moved away, while others claimed they were still inside, hiding. Kids had their own theory that the house swallowed children whole. My friends and I made a game out of telling stories about the place, daring each other to knock on the door every Halloween. No one ever did, of course, until that year. I was 12, full of bravado, and hopped up on too much candy. My best friend Darren double-dared me, and in a moment of adrenaline-fueled stupidity, I accepted the challenge. "I'm going to do it," I said. My friends laughed, but I saw a flicker of something else in their eyes, fear, maybe admiration. Either way, I couldn't back down now. As I approached the McFadden house, the sounds of the neighborhood seemed to fade. The laughter and music from the other homes became muffled, as though I was slipping out of reality and into something darker. The door looked worse up close, splintered and warped, as if something had tried to claw its way out. I reached for the rusted doorknob, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a long, narrow hallway bathed in dim yellow light. I hesitated. The air inside was thick and stale, dust motes floating in the weak light like the house hadn't been disturbed in years, but I had come this far, so I stepped inside. It didn't look like the abandoned home of some crazy old couple. In fact, it looked as if someone had been expecting me. Halloween decorations lined the hallway, cheap plastic spiders and fake cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, with a row of jack-o'-lanterns along the floor, their carved faces twisted into sinister grins. But the thing that struck me most were the photographs lining the walls, old black and white pictures of kids in Halloween costumes. Some looked happy, too happy, while others had something wrong with their eyes, hollow and vacant. I moved closer, squinting at the nearest photo. The boy looked about my age, grinning from ear to ear, but his eyes were dead. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized him. It was Tommy Harwell, the kid who disappeared last Halloween. We'd all heard stories, but everyone assumed he'd been kidnapped. I stared at the picture, a knot forming in my stomach. It couldn't be right. Tommy was gone. But here he was, smiling in a photo that looked decades old. Then I heard it, the sound of soft laughter echoing from somewhere deeper inside the house. It was a giggle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I took a step back, but the door behind me slammed shut with a bang that shook the walls. My heart pounded. I was trapped. I backed away from the door, and a cold breeze swept through the hallway, flickering the jack-o'-lantern's candles. Shadows stretched, growing long and distorted. From the corner of my eye, I saw something move. "Who's there?" I called out, but there was no response, just more of that eerie, distant laughter. Then out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was Tommy. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face twisted, but it wasn't the Tommy I remembered. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes empty, black pits stared right through me. "Tommy," I whispered. But he didn't respond. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed to the far end of the hallway. His voice came out as a rasp, heavy with sorrow. "You have to help us." I was frozen. I looked around, and suddenly the faces in the photo seemed to be watching me, their hollow eyes following my every move. Tommy stepped closer. "If you don't help, you'll become like us." A chill ran down my spine. "What do I have to do?" I asked, barely managing to speak. He pointed to a door at the end of the hallway. It looked just like the one I'd come through, but this one had something carved into it, my name. No, I whispered, shaking my head. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back to find another way out. But the look in Tommy's eyes, those dark, empty eyes, told me I had no choice. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling as I turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark staircase. I stepped through and the house seemed to sigh. The light behind me disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. I kept walking deeper and deeper and deeper until suddenly I was outside again. The house stood silent, its windows dark and lifeless. I ran back to my home, shaking as I told my parents everything. They thought I was just spooked by Halloween, but the next morning the street woke to sirens. The McFadden house was ablaze, engulfed in flames that reached 5 stories high. As I stood there watching, I saw the look in my parents' eyes, disbelief mixed with the faint understanding that somehow I'd been telling the truth. The kids who had disappeared over the years were never found. And to this day, every Halloween, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't opened that door. Do you know what it feels like to have a gun aimed at you? To hear the sickening crack of a bullet breaking through bone, to see blood spurt like a crimson fountain? Before that Halloween, I didn't. I was just a sweet kid who loved candy, trick-or-treating, and dressing up in costumes. You notice how I'm speaking in the past tense. That's because something happened that shattered my love for Halloween forever. I'm only 16 now, but after that horrific night, I carry enough trauma for a lifetime. We're too old for this, Josh grumbled as I dragged him along. Josh was my best friend, but he hated Halloween. Don't be a buzzkill. I can't go trick-or-treating alone, I pleaded, shaking my candy bag at him. We're only 13 once. Let's enjoy it while we can. Can't we just go to one of those cool Halloween parties like our brothers, Josh asked, pouting, the feelers on his bee costume bobbing. I shot him a stern look and he wilted under my glare. That was the thing about Josh, he'd go along with anything if I insisted hard enough. We hit a few houses and loaded up on candy, bouncing from porch to porch. The decorations were amazing jack-o'-lanterns glowing, creepy scarecrows looming, and fake cobwebs strung everywhere. I felt great in my Tinkerbell costume, but Josh's attitude didn't seem to improve. Then, as we rounded a corner, Josh's face lit up. "Hey, that's my dad," he yelled. Sure enough, it was Mr. Morrison, dressed like a pirate, complete with an eye patch and a fake parrot on his shoulder. "Hey kids, having fun?" he asked, grinning. "We're doing great, Mr. Morrison," I said, showing him my overflowing bag of candy. "Why are you out here?" "I'm trick-or-treating for Jenny," he replied. "She's too young to come this far, so I'm getting her a little candy." He held up a small bag and winked. "Awesome, let's hit that house together," Josh said, pointing to a dark, unlit house down the street. I hesitated. Something about that house chilled me. It was dark, with no decorations, and the yard was filled with broken bottles and scattered debris. A cold shiver crept down my spine, and my heart began to race. Just for a moment, I thought I heard something, a soft, raspy voice, almost like a deathly whisper, echoed in my mind. I couldn't make out any words, just an unintelligible sound that made my blood freeze. "Did you hear that I asked?" Josh and his dad looked at me confused, but I heard it again, or at least I was sure I did, that same monotone whisper. "Let's go home," I said quietly, dread settling into my stomach. "Go home? You're the one who dragged me out here," Josh laughed, bounding towards the Eerie house. Mr. Morrison followed close behind, and I reluctantly trailed after them, my heart pounding in my chest. "Trick or treat," they yelled at the door, laughing. The silence that followed was deafening. And then it happened. The front door exploded in a hail of bullets. the wood splintering under the barrage. Gunshots echoed through the night. It took me a second to understand what was happening. I dropped to the ground, covering my head, but I wasn't fast enough. A bullet tore into my shoulder, and a sharp, unbearable pain shot through me. The gunfire didn't stop. It went on for what felt like forever. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting ceased. A man stumbled out onto the porch, holding a smoking Alaska, his face pale and twisted with regret. I thought it was them, he stammered. I thought it was the ops. I'm so sorry. His eyes fell onto something near my feet, and his face crumbled. I followed his gaze and froze. Josh was lying on the ground, his eyes wide open, lifeless. Blood pooled around him, 2 bullet holes marking his skull. There was no mistaking it. He was dead. A single scream cut through the night. Josh's father, lying a few feet away and bleeding from his wounds, sobbed uncontrollably. My boy. My boy. The police and EMTs arrived shortly after. The man who shot at us was a gang member, paranoid and expecting an attack from his enemies. He thought we were them, a mistake. But Josh was still gone. My shoulder healed, but the pain in my heart never left. Sometimes I wonder if it was my fault for dragging Josh out that night. Other times I think about what I thought I saw and heard, and none of it makes any sense. When I woke up in the hospital, the first thing on my mind was Freddy Krueger. I know that probably sounds super weird, but trust me, you'll understand why once you hear the rest of my story. Just 5 hours earlier, I'd been at a Halloween college party. It was one of those no costume, no entry deals, so I was decked out in a tunic like the ones the Greeks used to wear, complete with a masquerade ball mask. I don't remember much about the party itself. There was a ton of beer, loud music, and people dancing everywhere. People just keep coming in, Ethan shouted over the music. Well, what did you expect? I shouted back, grinning. You advertise it as an open party. He scowled at me, clearly regretting the decision. Ethan, my best friend, had thrown the party but hadn't anticipated the massive turnout. He gave me a look before heading outside, probably to lock the gate. I shrugged it off and went back to dancing. With each sip of beer, I could feel myself getting more and more drunk. After a while, I made my way outside, needing a break from the crowded and sweaty house. The yard was quieter, with a few people passed out on the lawn. What a bunch of losers, I thought to myself. I looked over for Ethan and spotted him by the gate with his brother Eric. Something was going on, so I moved closer to see what was happening. You have to let us in, made a guy dressed as Freddy Krueger was shouting. Behind him were a few others dressed as classic horror movie characters, Jason, Michael Myers, and Ghostface, just to name a few. They were all demanding entry. I don't know you. You're not invited. Get the hell away from my house, Ethan shot back, clearly agitated. A small crowd from the party started to gather by the gate, curious about the commotion. We're not going anywhere, Freddy said, his tone dripping with anger. Something about the way he said it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Sure, getting denied entry to a party sucks, but his reaction felt off way too aggressive for someone we didn't even know. Ethan, let's just go back inside, I said, putting a hand on his shoulder. You're right, we'll leave these idiots out here and see how they like the cold, he agreed, turning to follow me. I said, let us in, Freddy screamed. The noise from the party suddenly seemed to fade. It was like the whole world went silent for a moment, and an eerie tension settled over us. I don't know if everyone felt it, but I sure did. Duck, I screamed, diving to the ground as Freddy pulled a gun from somewhere in his costume and started shooting. The sound of gunfire was deafening. Screams filled the air as people scattered in every direction. Glass shattered as bullets hit windows and cars. I felt a sharp, burning pain in my arm and looked down to see blood seeping through my costume. I'd been shot. It all happened so fast, less than a minute, but it felt like a lifetime. When I finally dared to look up, Freddy and his gang were gone, leaving several people on the ground. My heart sank when I saw Ethan lying there, unmoving. I rushed over to him. He wasn't conscious. Eric and another guy were also down, none of them moving. The ambulance arrived minutes later and rushed them to the university hospital. It wasn't until the medics were gone that I realized I'd been shot too. Shock does that to you. Fortunately, the wound wasn't too bad. The bullet had just grazed my arm. But I knew I needed to get it checked out, so I got into my car and started to drive to the hospital. That's when everything hit me how close I'd come to dying. My hand started shaking, and all I could feel was the panic rising in my chest. My heartbeat raced as my vision blurred. I don't know if it was the blood loss, the alcohol, or both, but I suddenly felt so tired. I lost control of the car and crashed into a building. Then everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital, Freddy Krueger on my mind. Makes sense now, right? I'm just grateful Ethan, Eric, and the other guy who got shot are all okay. They're stable, at least. As for Freddy and his friends, no one knows where they went after the shooting. It scares me to think that someone that unhinged is still out there somewhere. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a gentle glow over the crowded streets. Everywhere I looked, people were dressed in costumes, rushing through the night, immersed in the Halloween spirit. I too was swept up in the excitement, moving from house to house, shouting trick or treat. I was wearing a brown costume, and my best friends, Casey and Paul, were with me. We'd been inseparable since kindergarten, and at 12, Halloween was all about costumes and candy. We didn't think about its dark origins or the eerie legends that linger. That night, however, I learned more than I ever wanted to. Since then, I've never gone trick-or-treating again. I think we have enough candy, Casey said, showing us her bag, which was brimming with sweets of all kinds. No way. We can hit a few more houses, I replied, walking up the stairs of another house, practically forcing her and Paul to follow. A nice old lady answered the door and handed us a bunch of sweets with a warm smile. As we made our way down the stairs, Paul tugged at my sleeve, his expression uneasy. Guys, I think it's getting late. We should head back, Paul said, his eyes darting nervously around. Casey sighed. Yeah, I've got more than enough. Look at my bag, it's about to burst. I scoffed, rolling my eyes. Come on. Just a few more houses. Paul shook his head. No, really. I can't eat all this candy. Fine, leave, then I said, pushing ahead toward the next house. Casey hesitated for a second, then shrugged and followed Paul as he walked off. I watched them leave, annoyed but determined to get one last haul. I walked up the steps to a house at the end of the block. It was dimly lit, its porch creaking beneath my feet. I rang the doorbell, but there was no movement inside. Just as I turned to leave, a police officer passed by on the street. Hey, kid, he called out. You should head home. It's getting late. I glanced back at him. Yeah, okay, I muttered, not really intending to listen. As he walked away, though, something changed. The festive sounds of laughter and footsteps faded away, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. I stopped in my tracks as a strange feeling settled in my chest, like I wasn't alone, like someone was watching me. The air thickened, and I realized a dense fog had crept in out of nowhere, swirling around me. Suddenly, from within the fog, two glowing red eyes appeared. My heart pounded as the eyes drew closer, cutting through the mist like fire. As the fog dissipated, a figure emerged tall, imposing, clad in full samurai armor. At first, I almost laughed, thinking, nice costume, but then I saw the katana in his hand, dripping with fresh blood. I froze, my brain screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. "Sick fit, man," someone shouted from behind me. I turned to see a guy in a cartoon character costume approaching the samurai, grinning like he didn't have a care in the world. Without warning, the samurai lashed out, slashing the man's throat with a swift, precise motion. Blood sprayed everywhere, splattering onto my clothes and into my candy bag. The man collapsed, gurgling and clutching his neck as the crimson life drained from him. I stood there, paralyzed, watching as his life faded away. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My mind couldn't process what was happening. This was too real. Across the street, a woman saw the attack. She screamed, her voice piercing the night. The samurai turned his head slowly, locking eyes with her. In an instant, he was upon her, his katana slicing through the air. She fell to the ground, her clothes blooming with blood as she gasped for air. I watched, horror-stricken, my body trembling uncontrollably. I wanted to shout, to run, to do something, anything, but I was frozen. The fog swirled again, thick and unrelenting, swallowing the samurai whole until he disappeared like a ghost retreating into the night. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on me like a weight. I collapsed to the ground, curling into a ball, shaking uncontrollably. When the police found me, I couldn't speak. My clothes were stained with blood, my candy bag soaked. With the samurai, there was no trace. They asked me questions, but all I could do was stare into the distance, shivering. Later, I learned the man in samurai armor had killed 2 people and injured 5 before he was caught. But knowing that didn't bring me any comfort. Since that night, I've never gone out trick-or-treating again. I remember perfectly how that day we were in the country, in the middle of nowhere, because my parents wanted to buy a farm. I didn't want to be there, and I wasn't the least bit interested. It was just acres of empty land, an old barn, and a house that was barely standing. I guess it wasn't all that bad since I had brought my drone to kill time. I'd packed it just in case something like that happened. But even the landscape didn't lend itself to good videos. Everything was brown, dry, and drab. While my parents were talking to the seller at the main house, I decided to fly the drone around the property. Maybe I would find something interesting. After a while, I zoomed out a little further until I came to a cornfield. From above, the landscape didn't look so dull. As I flew the drone past the rows of corn, something caught my eye on the screen. Among the corn, something or someone was standing. I stopped the drone and adjusted the camera. I wasn't expecting it. It was a clown. He was standing completely still, just looking at me through the camera. My heart started beating faster. There was no reason for anyone to be there. We were in the middle of nowhere. For a moment, I thought it was some kind of joke. Maybe the farm salesman had a weird sense of humor, but there was something about that clown that didn't fit. He wasn't moving, he wasn't gesturing, he was simply looking down at the drone, his head slightly tilted. I felt an awkwardness that I couldn't explain, something that didn't make sense. I decided to fly the drone closer to get a better look. When I did, the clown turned sharply and started running toward the forest at the edge of the cornfield. I froze for a few seconds, not understanding what was going on. Something was not right. Why would he run away like that? Had I caught him doing something he wasn't supposed to do? I looked at the battery indicator and saw that it was about to run out, so I started to bring the drone back. I didn't realize what was happening until it was almost too late. As I looked at the drone screen, I saw that the clown was no longer running into the woods. It was following me. It was running after the drone, straight toward where I was. My first impulse was to panic. There was no point in flying the drone away. It was almost right next to me. To make matters worse, the battery indicator was red, and if I dropped it in the middle of the field, I would have to go out and look for it. I kept my cool as best I could and lowered it to the ground near my feet. I felt I didn't have much time. I was about to start running, but for some reason I didn't move. The clown was standing just at the edge of the forest, watching me. I picked up the drone from the ground and started walking toward the barn, trying not to run to pretend nothing had happened. I don't know what I thought. I guess I wanted to make him think that my parents were in the barn and that I was with them. It doesn't make sense, but it was the only thing I could think of at the time. Contrary to my slow movements, my mind was racing. I knew that if I ran, I could attract more attention. I was alone and my parents didn't know anything about what was going on. I was afraid that if I walked to the main house, the clown would know I was alone and catch up with me. When I got to the barn, I hid under an old wooden table in the back. There wasn't much else to hide under, but from there I could see the entrance. To my terror, the clown followed me. The strange thing was that, despite standing at the barn door, he didn't come in. I saw him standing outside looking at his cell phone, typing something. For a moment I thought he would leave, but then another clown appeared and then another. In less than a minute, there were 6 clowns outside the barn. They weren't talking to each other, just exchanging glances and then pointing toward the door. I had no way out. If I ran, they would catch me. If I stayed hidden, they would eventually find me. My mind tried to process what was going on, but nothing made sense. Why were they here? What did they want? I watched as they agreed to go in. The first one through the door was the clown who had been typing on his cell phone. The others followed in line. My heart was about to explode. They were searching the whole place. I knew they would find me sooner or later, but I couldn't move. Any sound could give me away. One of the clowns passed very close to the table where I was. I could see his feet moving slowly as he looked for something. I breathed as slowly as I could, trying not to make any noise. I had to think of something I had to get out of there. The clown leaned toward the table, and I thought that was the end of it. At that moment, without much thought, I ran out. I ran with all my might toward the door. The clowns noticed, and in that second, I knew I had little chance of getting out. I managed to dodge all the ones that appeared on the short way, but almost at the end, they caught me. One of them, the first one I had seen, grabbed me by my shirt and threw me to the ground. I felt the thud against the dirt of the barn, but I got up quickly, or at least I tried to. It wasn't enough. Before I could take another step, the 6 clowns surrounded me. I didn't know where they were coming from or who was hitting me. All I felt was pain. I tried to cover my face with my arms, but there were too many of them. Everything was fast and confusing. They were a bunch of grown men kicking me on the ground with all the violence they could. I was covering my face, but they were kicking me in my stomach, the ribs, and between my legs. One even tried to kick me in the neck, though I was in a fetal position to avoid that. I felt the impact. Suddenly, I heard my dad's voice calling me from outside the barn. The clowns stopped for a second, looking at each other. I could barely move, but I knew this was my chance. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was so weak I could barely stand up. My dad walked into the barn, and before I could do anything, the clowns surrounded him too. The scene that followed was worse than I imagined. I saw my dad fall to the ground under a hell of blows. He was trying to defend himself, but he didn't stand a chance against them. I felt a desperation that I can't describe. I wanted to help him, but my body didn't respond. I wanted to scream, but the air wouldn't leave my lungs. I thought they didn't hold back with me, but with my father, it was much worse. They were hitting him much harder. They wanted to kill him. Suddenly, there was a scream from outside. It was the owner of the farm with a shovel in his hand telling them that he had called the police. The clowns, hearing this, started to back away and leave, but one of them didn't want to leave. Furious that his fun was over, he picked up a huge metal plate he had found in the barn and walked toward me. His intention was clear. He wanted to smash my head with it. He approached me slowly, laughing like a psychopath. He stood in front of me and picked it up. He was going to kill me. But at that moment, another clown stopped him. Mitch, what do you think you're doing? Do you think the cops will follow us for beating them up? Imagine if you kill a child, it'll be a damn witch hunt. We'll all go down because of you. Furious, the man gave me another kick and started running with the other clowns. Soon after the paramedics and the police arrived, they only found and arrested 2 of the 6 clowns, but the one who had tried to kill me was among them. Both my dad and I were taken to the hospital. We were alive, but barely. The clown who tried to kill me was convicted of attempted murder. At the time, we were all upset that the conviction wasn't much bigger. But in that moment, I remembered the words of the other clown. If he hadn't stopped him, the men would have been sentenced for much longer, but I wouldn't be alive to tell you this. It all happened one Halloween night, the night all of us kids looked forward to. I was 13 years old and my sister Emma was 11. Together we had toured the neighborhood houses with our friends, but the candy bag was almost empty. Every year it was the same. The bigger, more decorated houses gave very little candy. I was frustrated, and so was Emma. We wanted more. At one point, one of the kids in the group mentioned a house, one that no one wanted to go to, even though they said the guy who lived there always bought lots of candy. He was an old man who lived at the end of the street. His house wasn't overly decorated and lit up, but no one in the neighborhood dared to knock on his door, least of all on Halloween. But I didn't believe in that nonsense. Let's go to that house, I said. Emma hesitated for a second, but agreed. She always trusted me. The rest of our friends refused. Dude, do you guys have a death wish? My parents always tell me to stay away from there. I've seen that man, he looks like a psycho. Oh, come on, guys. There are too many of us. What could happen to us? No way, bro. If you go, you and Emma are on your own. I didn't care and decided we had to go anyway. I made fun of them for chickening out, and we just went. Emma laughed too, but she was really just going along with me. When we arrived, my legs were a little shaky. My bravery didn't last long. Emma didn't say anything, but I could tell she was nervous too. The house was old but not dilapidated. The garden was impeccable, as if someone took care of it every day. I knocked on the door. A few seconds passed, and then the door slowly opened. The man who opened the door was thin and dressed strangely, almost old-fashioned. His smile was huge, too friendly for someone who barely knew 2 children. Well, what a surprise. Trick or treat, huh? I nodded without saying a word. Something about his tone didn't sit well with me, but I wasn't going to show fear in front of Emma. Sure, I got a lot of candy, but it's inside. No one else came this year. Do you want to come by and pick them up? I kept quiet, but Emma looked at me excitedly. I couldn't leave anymore, especially after being offered candy. I was 13, I wasn't stupid, I knew I should never go into a stranger's house. But this wasn't just a stranger, he was also a neighbor. He wasn't going to do anything to us. Our parents were probably paranoid. The man was still smiling, and before I could think more, he had already taken a step inside, and Emma followed him. So did I. The inside of the house was very different from the outside. Everything was dark, and there was a weird smell like old food. The man said to sit down for a moment and relax before he gave us the candy, since we looked like we were tired. I love Halloween. It's a special night. What do you mean? I asked. You know, the masks, the candy, the friends. It's just a great date, a date full of fantasy and wonder. Oh yeah, we like it too. I love stories. Do you like stories? Emma and I looked at each other in confusion. I guess we do, I replied. The man laughed, a soft but uncomfortable laugh. My favorite story has always been Hansel and Gretel. It's so symbolic, too lonely but brave children. You know, you guys, you're perfect to play them. We didn't understand what he was talking about, Emma and I. I had never read Hansel and Gretel, we only knew the title. But before we could ask, the man started walking toward the kitchen, motioning for us to follow him. Something in my stomach began to twist, but we were already too far into the situation. Come on, I want to show you something. The kitchen was small, and the first thing I noticed was a large oven in the corner. The man was looking at it with a smile, as if it were his most prized possession. This is my oven. It's very similar to Hansel and Gretel's. And to top it all off, it works very well. Do you want to see how? Before I could answer, he turned on the oven, and the heat began to fill the room. Something wasn't right. I wanted to get out, but I didn't know how to leave. For sure, we were going to have to wait for this psycho to show us every appliance in the house. Emma looked at me with wide eyes, frightened. Then, without warning, the man grabbed Emma by the arm. Come here, little girl. I'll show you how the story goes. Emma screamed in pain as he tried to drag her toward the oven. The man opened the door with one hand as he tried to pull Emma inside. Emma struggled with all her might, but the man was too strong. He pushed her toward the oven, and even though she didn't fit, he tried to force her in. Emma wouldn't go in. The man was hurting her. My sister's screams covered the whole house. They were not only cries for help, but also cries of pain. I tried to attack him, but he pushed me away easily. I moved around the kitchen, looking for anything I could use to stop him. There were no knives in sight, nothing useful. The only thing I found was a plate on the table. Without thinking, I grabbed it and smashed it against the man's head. The man screamed not so much in pain, but in fury. Emma fell to the floor, gasping, trying to pull away, but instead of giving up, the man turned to me, his eyes filled with a fury I'd never seen in anyone before. You can't wait your turn, huh? You're perfect too, little Hansel. The man now gripped my arm tightly. I felt his fingers dig into my skin as if he were trying to break my bones. The man also tried to put me in the oven. But if my little sister couldn't fit, I couldn't either. You don't fit in the oven either. But don't worry, I'll get you in pieces. His tone of voice changed, and I could see that he had completely lost his mind. The man threw me down on the table, forcing my arm behind me. I screamed in pain as he reached for something in a drawer. I couldn't move, but I felt the cold surface of the table against my face and his breath on the back of my neck. He pulled out a long, shiny knife. First, we'll cut off an arm, then a leg. I suppose you'll fit perfectly in the oven if I distribute you well. I didn't know what to do. I tried to free myself, but it was useless. My strength was not enough. Emma wasn't doing anything to save me either. She was on the floor, crying in terror at what was happening. The knife was inches away from my arm. He was going to kill me. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise. The front door burst open. The man stopped and looked toward the door, confused. It was at that moment that I saw my parents, along with the other adults, burst into the house. They all lunged at the man. My mother pulled me off the table, while my father and the others held him back. The man was screaming, struggling, but no longer in control. The man was simply crying, as if he was the victim. Who do you think I am? I wasn't going to eat them. I just wanted to cook them, like in the book. I swear I was going to give them back. Stop hurting me. It hurts. The man was still screaming as the police handcuffed him and took him away. Emma was on the floor, hugged by her mother, still crying but alive. My hands were shaking. I couldn't believe what had happened. I was seconds away from losing my arm, from losing my life, and all because I wanted some candy. After everything, we found out how the parents arrived on time. Our friends, the ones who didn't want to go into the house, saw that we weren't coming back and got scared. They went running to tell their parents, and in a matter of minutes, they organized to come and get us. The man was arrested and convicted. No one in the neighborhood ever spoke of him again. The house was sold, and a new family moved in as if nothing had happened. The next family that went to that house was a lot nicer, and they loved Halloween, but we never trick-or-treated there again. After that night, Halloween wasn't so much fun anymore, and no amount of candy could ever change that. I'm Jake, and I'll start by clarifying something I don't like horror stories. Not because I'm scared, no, but because horror seems kind of dumb to me. I've never been one to scare easily. Before I came to live in town with my mother, I lived in a neighborhood where insecurity was a huge problem and people had real things to worry about. But one day I understood terror. I understood being in a situation far from human understanding, something you can't fight against. And, I don't understand what you might like about it, because in my case, it was the worst situation I ever lived through in my life. It was a cold autumn night when my friends and I decided to go to the carnival that had come to town. It wasn't a big event, just a few old rides and a Ferris wheel that squeaked every time it turned. But we were teenagers in a small town, and something as simple as this was very exciting. The carnival was full of lights and music that we were not used to hearing. I had indeed lived out of town for a long time, but since our economic situation was terrible, we didn't go anywhere anyway. The situation was different. This time, the smell of cotton candy and fried food was in the air, mixed with the laughter of children and the screams of those who rode the rides. Around midnight, the group decided to split up. Some wanted to try their luck on the rides, others wanted to go home. I, for some reason, decided to explore on my own. I felt strange, uneasy. I felt like the pressure was off me, but I didn't want to admit it. I just knew I needed to get away for a moment. I walked among the rides, avoiding the crowds and looking for a quieter spot. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a small, ramshackle tent half hidden behind the other booths. It had no sign indicating what it was, just a dark entrance that seemed to absorb the little light that surrounded it. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached the tent, feeling a strange attraction to it. As I got closer, I noticed that the air around it was colder, as if that small structure was isolated from the rest of the carnival. There was no one else around, as if everyone else had decided to ignore it. Maybe there was a reason for that. I decided to go inside. As I crossed the threshold, I realized that the interior was much larger than it appeared from the outside. The atmosphere was oppressive, and the silence inside made me feel as if I had entered another world. Something was wrong. I felt it in my bones, but I couldn't turn back. Something was calling me to go on. The huge tent was empty, except for one thing. In the center, a set of stairs led down. When I went down, there was only a long corridor there that stretched out. It was very strange, like I was in the subway about to travel somewhere. With every step I took, the air became heavier, as if something invisible was pushing me backward. But I continued as if I had no control over my own feet. At that point, I wasn't even thinking anymore, just walking forward. I felt like I was hypnotized. After walking for what seemed like minutes, I came to a wooden door at the end of the hallway. It was ajar, and a dim light was filtering through the crack. With a mixture of curiosity and fear, I pushed the door, which gave way with an unsettling creak. What I saw inside left me frozen in place. It was a staircase, narrow and steep, descending into darkness. The light barely illuminated the first few steps, leaving the rest shrouded in total blackness. I felt a knot in my stomach, as if my body knew not to go down those stairs. But something in my mind, something that was not quite normal, pushed me to continue. I went down the first step, then another, and another. Darkness surrounded me, and the silence was so deep that I could hear my heart beating. The staircase seemed endless, and with every step I took, fear grew inside me. but I could not stop. Something kept calling me, something I could not ignore. At that moment, I came back to reality and reacted. What the hell was I doing there? Why had I taken a dark staircase in the middle of nowhere? As I monologued in my head, I noticed that I kept going down. I couldn't stop doing it. It wasn't that my legs were moving on their own, but something in my head was telling me that I had to keep going down. There was no way of knowing how long I was going down, only that every second that passed, I felt more trapped. I could see absolutely nothing. How much time had passed? Would my friends come looking for me? I screamed as loud as I could, but no one heard me. And yet, I was still going down. Rationalizing this made my head suddenly clear. I stopped walking. How the hell had I ended up here? My instincts were screaming at me to get out, to run, but my legs weren't responding well. They were heavy. At that moment, I was making a huge effort to fight the urge to keep going down. I turned around, determined to escape from that place. I began to climb each step, forcing my body to move. But then I heard footsteps above me. The echo was soft at first, as if someone was moving calmly, measuring each step. But as I climbed, the sounds accelerated as well. Heavy footsteps, rapid. I couldn't see anything, just darkness, but whatever was up there was coming down, and it was coming down fast. My heart started hammering against my chest. For some reason, I knew that whoever was coming down couldn't be someone good, someone who would help me. I had the strange feeling that what was coming at me was death itself. As if my premonition wasn't enough, the next thing came in a matter of seconds: blood. First, it was just a drop, which fell on my face, then another and another. I looked up, blurry-eyed, and saw nothing, but felt the sticky liquid now sliding down my forehead and into my mouth. The steps were also getting wetter and wetter. All that blood was fresh. Someone was dripping from above. My legs, previously unresponsive, were now moving at full speed. I started down without thinking. I didn't care where the stairs took me. I just wanted to get away from whatever was coming toward me. But the footsteps were speeding up too, closer and closer. I could feel the ground shaking under my feet with every footstep. And then I felt it. An icy hand rested on my shoulder. It was bony, almost skeletal. I turned around to see who was behind me, and when I did, panic and surprise made me lose my balance. My feet slipped on the wet steps and I fell. But it wasn't a simple fall. I tumbled down the stairs and felt my bones creak with each blow. The pain was excruciating, but I kept falling down and down as if the ladder had no end. My arms were twisted at impossible angles, and still I kept falling. I screamed a lot, so much that my throat was sore, but no one would listen to me. I don't know how long I was falling. I just know that at some point, the pain faded away. Everything faded away, and my mind shut down. The next thing I remember was opening my eyes. I was outside. Night had fallen completely, and I was lying in a ditch by the side of the road outside the carnival. My bones ached, broken in several places, and I had dried blood caked on my clothes and face. The pain was intense, but somehow I had gotten out of that place. I didn't know how or why I was still alive, but I was. Days later, with a cast on my leg and bandages covering my arms, I convinced my friends to go back to that place before the carnival left town. I knew they wouldn't believe me, but I told them about the place anyway. I was surprised to have caught their attention, so much so that they tried to go with me to see the place from afar. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. I wanted to show them even the tent. But when we arrived, the tent was gone. There wasn't even a trace of it, just dirt and grass, as if it had never existed. My friends looked at me as if I had lost my mind, and maybe I had. The fair was still going on for a few more days, and that's when I realized something. Maybe I had saved myself and found a way out by chance. Maybe someone had forgiven me just for fun, but whatever happened, one thing is for sure: I wasn't at that carnival or in a tent. I was in something else, something indescribable, something that escapes human logic. And in short, something that I escaped by pure chance. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. Would I have starved to death? Would they have fed me only to continue torturing me, whatever the answer is? There is one great truth. If I had stayed on those stairs, a fate even worse than death would have awaited me.